This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today's episode is part 5, five-part series on the history of the church in Alaska. And of course, Adam is back. If you have been tracking with us this far, bless you, way to go. Believe it or not, this is a condensed version of Adam's material on this. He normally teaches it as a class at a college, and so he's condensing it for us. And so today we're going to cover two more. The last two we're going to do today is Salvation Army and the Lutheran Church, and maybe a mention of a couple others at the end. And so without further ado, Adam, welcome back, and I will hand you the mic.
Awesome. Thanks, Billy. Great to be back with you, and fun to talk about the first missions on the board in Alaska. And so it's good to get to kind of the end here and see some of the last churches and what they did. And so first we're going to start off with the Salvation Army. And usually when we think about the Salvation Army, at least most of us, we don't think of it as a church. We think of those bell ringers around Christmas time, think about the thrift store. You might think about homeless shelters. And those are definitely all part of the Salvation Army and have been, well, maybe not the bell ringing, but those different missions have been part of the Salvation Army really since almost the beginning of Salvation Army in Alaska and abroad. And so those are good things to think about, but they also have worship centers. And so if you go to Anchorage, there are Sunday morning services that you can go to in the Salvation Army. And it's not as advertised as some of their other services, but especially down in the southeast, there's still a strong presence of the Salvation Army Church. In fact, you can even go down to Homer, and there's a Salvation Army Church down there as well. And so I feel like, I don't know what the stats are between Alaska and lower 48, but I feel like per capita, there's more Salvation Army churches still here. Or maybe I just don't see them in the lower 48 as much. But Salvation Army, they were one of the denominations, if you will, that responded to Sheldon Jackson's plea for missionaries to come. And so they came out in the late 1800s, so they were a little bit later than some of the other groups, but they were still part of that comity plan, that agreement to divide and conquer, to not compete with one another. And so just a quick little, as I like to go through each denomination, little background in case you're not familiar, as probably most of us are not familiar with the Salvation Army Church, kind of the beginnings of the Salvation Army. It started from William and Catherine Booth. And so this was a family ministry, and they, in 1865, so this was actually real close to the call to Alaska missions. So Salvation Army was fresh when Alaska became a field for most churches. So anyways, 1865, the William and Catherine Booth and their family, they would go around London and they would try to hold tent revivals. And so they were part of this thing called the Christian Revival Society. They, however, though, were a little bit maybe more charismatic than the Methodist Church, which is what William Booth had come from. He was a Methodist preacher, so he was trying to be part of this Christian Revival Society as part of the Methodist Church. Unfortunately, the Methodist Church didn't like his methods and told him to stop holding meetings and to focus on his own church that he was supposed to be pastoring. And Booth didn't take that very well, so he left the Methodist Church and began to just do these Revival Society meetings. And their target audience was the poor and the marginalized. And so that was, you can see that in the Salvation Army even today. Their target audience is the poor and the marginalized. And so they modeled their movement after the army, which is why it's called the Salvation Army. And so if you've ever met anybody who works for the Salvation Army church, they have, rather than things like pastor or reverend or bishop, they have army titles. So there's like lieutenant general and brigadier general and all of these different things that, for those of us that don't know military rankings, it probably is super confusing. And so I don't actually honestly know what all the different rankings mean within the Salvation Army, but that's how they organized. And it's obviously worked for them because they are a worldwide organization now. But they originally were started with the name Volunteer Army. And so William Booth called the people who were part of this Christian Revival Society the Volunteer Army, but they changed their name because Booth's son, he objected. He said, "I'm not a volunteer, I'm a regular." And so Booth changed the name to Salvation Army, and that name stuck. And so the Salvation Army, they started spreading out from London into Canada, really actually at first. And so they started doing work in Canada before they came over to Alaska. And so you might notice a theme here amongst the different denominations. Most of the denominations did not actually come from America. They came from Canada, came from Sweden, came from Germany. And so kind of the idea that the missionaries came to Americanize just is faulty. And certainly there were some Western ideas that were probably in there, but the majority of the missionaries had zero desire to Americanize the native people. And so the Salvation Army, yeah. So that's hopefully, if nothing else, that can help change people's thinking if hearing that. But so the Salvation Army, they had started work, especially amongst the native people in Canada before they came over here. And what got the Salvation Army interested in Alaska was not as much Sheldon Jackson's plea for missionaries, but actually the gold rush. And so some of the people that the Salvation Army had been ministering to in Canada were leaving and going to Alaska to try to strike it rich. And if you know anything about gold mining, I'd say the majority of the people who are trying to strike it rich are really just gamblers. They don't really know what they're doing, and that's even true today. If you go to Nome, there's still people who will show up on the shores and camp out in the summertime hoping to strike it rich, and the vast majority of them don't make anything. They probably lost a lot of money by moving to live there for the summer and living there. And so back then was also true. Not very many of the gold rushers actually struck it rich. And so the Salvation Army recognized that there was a lot of these gamblers who were going and were going to have a lot of serious needs. And so William Booth, he said, this is a quote from William Booth: "Some men's passion is gold, some men's passion is fame, and some men's passion is art. My passion is the souls of men." And so he kind of had that as a juxtaposition between the gold miners and the Salvation Army.
That summarizes that whole thing so well. I love that. That one quote summarizes that entire situation just perfectly. Wise men have wise quotes. I love that.
That's right. And William Booth, he was wise, but also pretty crazy. And so praise the Lord for that. And so he sent his sister, Evangeline Booth, not his sister, his daughter, Evangeline Booth. She was the daughter of the founder, William Booth. And so Evangeline actually oversaw the whole Salvation Army in Canada. And so Evangeline actually led the expedition along the Klondike Trail. So they wanted to follow the same trail that the gold miners were looking to cross. And so they took 8 people. Eva, as she was called, Evangeline, people called her Eva. She recruited a team of 8 Canadians to follow the Klondike Trail, and they also had a native interpreter go with them. And I don't know how effective that was, going from tribe to tribe, but it would appear that this interpreter was helpful in some ways. But the most important thing about this, though, is that the first convert that the Salvation Army had was that native interpreter. And so on the way from Canada to Alaska, they had their first convert, the native interpreter, who was part of that first mission expedition. So that's pretty cool. And and so I think all of us probably have met recently converted people. And while I don't know for certain that this young native interpreter was as excited as some of recent converts that I've known, I'd anticipate that he was probably pretty excited. I mean, you don't just go on a journey like this and not have some sense of craziness and excitement. And so it appears that they had some pretty good success, I'd say largely due to this native interpreter. And so they met with other natives on their way along the Klondike Trail. And it's interesting that one of the native girls that they ministered to was she can be known as Nellie Willard. Doesn't record what her native name was, but Nellie Willard. She noted later on that something that made the Salvation Army group different than other Western groups that she had encountered was that they ate with the native people and ate native food. Wow. And so she noted that it was special to her that the Salvation Army people ate seaweed, dried seal, and dried fish dipped in whale oil. So
good on them.
Salvation Army's
good
credit.
on them. Yeah, I like there's just something so powerful about a meal with people. In how many stories in the gospel, Jesus is simply eating a meal. And our family eats together every night. That's and eating what's set before them. Very powerful stuff. I love that.
Amen. Yeah, definitely reminds me of Peter, who was, I don't know if I should eat this stuff. And Jesus 3 times, you can eat it. You can eat it. You can eat it. And Paul, of course, talks a lot about, don't just eat what you're comfortable eating. It's about other people. And so,
yep.
Yeah, the Salvation Army always kind of had this idea that they were not coming in to take the culture, but rather they were coming to affirm the culture. And I'd say the best out of all of the 10, 12 groups that came early on, they affirmed the native culture more than any other, I would say. And so as a result of that, a lot of native people came to Christ. But the Salvation Army had a real different method of building churches and spreading the gospel. So that same girl, Nellie Willard, who loved that the Salvation Army ate with their native food, she pled to go along with Eva and to go on her journeys. And Eva said, "No, go back to your village, tell your people about Jesus." And it wasn't like, "Oh yeah, I know you need to be trained. No, you have the truth, go back and tell them." And definitely reminds me of some stories in the Bible of, the Samaritan woman at the well. I mean, she didn't follow Jesus around as people like Mary Magdalene did. She just went straight back and told everybody, "Hey, I just met Jesus. I just met the Messiah."
Yeah.
And
she didn't even go to seminary. Amazing.
I know. I can't believe it. But so the Salvation Army, they seem to not be afraid that people were going to make a mess of theology, and that is perhaps a good challenge for us too. Sometimes we get stuck in that idea that you have to be super educated to go and spread the gospel. But let me tell you what, I have met a lot of educated people who propagate some weird theology, and so I don't know that education actually fixes that problem. I think that's the more the purpose of the church, that it should be that we are iron sharpening iron. We gotta get some of those rough edges off. And I think
it's an interesting balance it's an interesting balance to, try to weave that, because we want to uphold the value of education because it is valuable, but also recognizing you don't have to have all that to just simply share the gospel. The message is simple enough. You don't need years and years of education, but the education is really good too. And so it's kind of that balance, and it can mess you up too. You go and you learn weird things. There's indoctrination issues and stuff like that. So, yep, definitely need wisdom no matter what.
Yep, and I think God calls all people differently. And I personally have my MDiv and I'm ordained, so I obviously did a lot of education. But I also see people like Nellie Willard, who God used. So I think you can't just always say there's only one pathway. There's many. God is very creative. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
And so anyways, Salvation Army, going back to them. So they're on their way to Alaska, and they were telling Native groups all along the way about Jesus. And while I believe so, when Eva Evangeline Booth and her crew made it to Alaska, she notes in her journals that that Native people started coming to them rather than them having to go to Native people. And I think probably part of that was that they were later on in the scene. And so probably some of the Native groups that didn't have missionaries yet saw that some really good things came from having missionaries, whether it be schools or orphanages or whatnot. So there were Native groups that came to the Salvation Army asking for help. In particular, there was an Indian chief that extended a hand of welcome and requested that the commander, Evangeline Booth, and those in her company, and those with her, accompany them to the hall. And it's really cool that Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morris, I don't know how that works as far as rankings, but Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morris, he wrote in his journals that it was such a privilege to be there with the marching to the heavy beating of the drum over an Indian village. And so you'll hear stories of like the church came to take away the drums and to take away Native dance. But in this case, the Salvation Army loved that they used drums. And in fact, when the Salvation Army opened their first church, they had Native drums and they had Native dance as part of that ceremony. There's also a story later on, once they were a little bit more established, of how there was a group of Native people that literally left the Methodist Church and went to the Salvation Army because they wanted to use drums and tambourines. They specifically noted tambourines. Maybe we need to have more tambourines in our churches in order to have more Native people. I don't know, but I think really it was more about the percussion, and it was more close to the way that their traditional ways were.
Well, and percussion is very much a military thing too. Speaking of, Salvation Army with Lieutenant Colonel Morris there, the percussion and military do seem to go together. So that was a good mix.
That's true. So, anyways, they made it to Alaska, and they saw there was a great need. There was all of these gold miners that didn't have any place to go. There was not enough resources to care for all of the mouths to feed. And so one of the first things that the Salvation Army did is they bought food. They asked for food to be sent. I don't know exactly how they got all of this, but they served 300 Christmas dinners to the poor and the needy on their first Christmas there in 1898. And so that was the beginnings, really, of the big formal ministry of the Salvation Army in Alaska.
Wow.
And so it took them a while to kind of establish the churches, but they continue to do some of these compassion and mercy ministries around the area, and they really kind of focused on Skagway. And so August 1899, Captain Laura McGill began going from Skagway to all of the villages around, and so she was doing gospel trips at that point. And one of their first converts was Joe Wright, and that's a real interesting story. Joe Wright was a native man that he had heard about Jesus in one of these evangelistic meetings, and he said that he wanted to follow Jesus. And as he made that confession of faith, he felt convicted to go and turn himself into the police, for he had actually murdered a person in his earlier life. And so he went and turned himself in, and they sent him to jail, and he was discipled while in jail. And when he came out, I don't know how long he was in, but it doesn't seem like it was that long. He came out and he became a Salvation Army worship leader using the drum that he had made himself with by stretching deerskin over a wooden frame. Wow. So that's kind of a cool story there of like serious repentance. And this guy had gotten away literally with murder, and nobody would have ever known, but he turned himself in because he wanted to cast his old life off and have the new life of Jesus Christ. And
wow.
So
I love that story. Cool. Wow.
So stories like that of some of these evangelistic meetings that they had and people coming to faith, and very, very often the people who came to faith were immediately drafted into the army, as it were, and they became workers immediately. It wasn't down the road, but you can enlist immediately and be part of the work here. So that's kind of how they got their start. And as they got more converts, and they established the churches and the mission centers, mostly around the southeast area, so around Skagway, Cake, that area down there. And so if you were to look at a map of the Comedy Plan, you would see that the Presbyterian Church actually gave the Salvation Army the assignment of the southeast area. And so I don't know how much of that was that the Salvation Army did that on their own, and then Sheldon Jackson kind of blessed it afterwards, or if he actually asked them, hey, there is a need, and especially some of these villages that haven't been reached, can you take this on as your area? But so whereas a lot of the other denominations started in Southeast and then moved west, the Salvation Army really pretty much stayed there as their main focus, but not just amongst the white population. They were very intentional about reaching the native population. So that's kind of their start. And they, of course, there was already denominations there, so there were different interactions. They had interactions with the Quakers, the Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalian, and the history book for the Salvation Army says that all of these interactions were very positive. Although when you go to some of the other books, then they're not always as positive. Might remember that the Quakers noted that they were called a rotten fish with no life.
Yes.
So, and then also in the same Salvation Army history book, it notes about how a group of native Methodist people left the Methodist Church to come over to the Salvation Army, and I'm sure that didn't go over super well. So. You can sometimes rose color some historical things.
You can read between the lines, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the general idea that the Salvation Army was trying not to be a bad neighbor, I think, is generally true.
Sure.
And they kind of didn't really care that much if people went to the Salvation Army or they went to other churches. It was more about let's spread the gospel. Let's not just stay stagnant. I'd say is probably one of their biggest things, is they wanted to keep advancing, and that's part of the Salvation Army language. What's the purpose of an army? Not just to stay stagnant. You're supposed to advance, and so advancing the kingdom of God, and that's a good challenge for us as well. But all right, so few more things with Salvation Army, then we'll move on to the Lutherans. But one area of overlap with the Quaker Church was one of the Tlingit native people who had become a Christian under the Quakers Church. And so Charles Newton was his name, and he was from the village of Cake. And if you remember from last podcast, we talked a little bit about Cake, and specifically Quaker missionary Edwards and how he was murdered. He and a native friend were murdered as they were trying to stop the importation of alcohol, and that spurred on a big mission movement amongst the Quakers. So one of those converts that converted because of seeing Edwards' murder was Charles Newton, and so he was a Quaker convert, but he became a leader in the Salvation Army. And so that's an area where there was a little bit of overlap and perhaps friction, but also cooperation. And so Charles Newton became one of the most important leaders in the Native Salvation Army in Alaska. And so one thing that is incredibly awesome is that, well, a couple things. First of all, so Newton, once he became a leader in the Salvation Army, he tells about how there was a shaman who tried to curse him, and a shaman that didn't like that he was following Jesus and said that he put a curse on Newton and was going to, and that he was going to die, that Charles Newton was going to die that winter. And Newton basically told everybody around that there is no power in this shaman. The real power is in God. And so the people were watching him, and when he made it to the spring, then he declared God is all powerful. And there was many people in the native village there that came to Christ because of that, which is cool. But okay, so one of the coolest things though is that Charles Newton, a little bit later on, already been an established Salvation Army leader, he led the tribe of Cake to becoming U.S. citizens in 1912. And so this was a huge, huge deal, and people don't talk about this too often. And obviously there's some people who might say that Native people becoming U.S. citizens maybe wasn't the right path, and there's some colonization in there, whatever, regardless. But keep in mind, this was a Native believer who made this push. So Charles Newton is the one who made this push, but it was a lot harder to do than it is for us, say today, for an immigrant to become a citizen. And it's not that easy for our immigrant to become a citizen anyway. But for them, back then, Native people did not have a pathway to becoming a citizen at all, period.
Wow.
And so this wasn't just like they had heard other Native people had become citizens and they wanted to become citizens. No, there was literally no Alaskan Native people that were United States citizens. So Charles Newton from Cake, a Salvation Army leader, he paved the way for all Alaskan Native people to become full citizens. And because of the Cake tribe doing it, the United States declared that all Native people were full citizens with all the rights and privileges of full citizenship.
Wow, so that's huge. That's
huge.
Like a big historical change.
And you really just don't hear about that very often.
I'll have to process. I'm trying to process that, like good or bad, them becoming American citizens. I'm sort of biased towards it's great that they become American citizens, but that's a huge though, that change there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that it, in a lot of ways, empowered the tribe. At least in this instance, I'd say perhaps maybe in some other instances where like the government went in and did a government-led school and changed everybody's names to English names because they were now American citizens. I'd say maybe that was a case of colonization there. But in this case, with Charles Newton leading his own tribe to seeking citizenship, I'd say that this was very positive. That's my own personal take on that one. Anyway. Sure. But so Charles Newton, he was a big part of the Salvation Army in the early days. And by 1917, due in part to Charles Newton and some other Native leaders. There was 11 Native officers in the Salvation Army. By 1925, there was 19. And so this was a big, big push by the Salvation Army. Have the people lead themselves.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, we talked a little bit about, education. Where does that play in? So Salvation Army was not above the idea that education is also valuable. So in 1925, they started up a Native training program in Wrangell. And so, so that's also another part of what is needed. So that, I'd say, really gives a good picture of the Salvation Army, what they did in the early days. They took a lot of gospel trips. They did a lot of compassion and justice ministry, caring for the lost and the needy. And so we can see some of that today. It wasn't until the 40s that Salvation Army started moving north. 1943, they entered Anchorage. And one of their main areas of why they entered Anchorage is addiction recovery ministry, and they wanted to enter into specifically alcohol, trying to bring recovery from alcohol. And so we see that still today in Salvation Armies. 1944 Salvation Army left the Canadian hands and became an American field. And so that's also something pretty significant. It wasn't until 1944 that Salvation Army was an American movement. It was Canadian supervised for the first 50 years.
Wow.
And
I
so
didn't know
the idea
that.
that they came into so the idea that they came into Americanized is just totally false. So 1944, they became part of the American field. 1945, the Salvation Army had its first and perhaps only martyr. And so Brigadier Robert Lesher was preaching in Douglas, open air preaching, as was often their practice. And a mining superintendent was angry and pulled out his revolver and shot him dead on the spot. And
that's like an assassination.
So
wow.
Yeah. And you don't think about those things too often in like the 1940s happening in America, but there it was there. So that's just kind of a point of interest there. Fast forward, last couple of things. 1963, Tlingit Tommy Jackson became an officer and served until 1991. And so there was Native people that served for long periods, which really has helped Salvation Army to thrive. In 1995, Florence Murray was promoted to major, the highest rank held by an Alaskan Native. And so I'd say at this point, there has been the opportunity for Native people to be at all levels of the Salvation Army in Alaska. And so you don't necessarily see that as much where we're at, but I think if you were to go down to the southeast, you'd see that more. And Salvation Army, they're legit. Who knew, right?
Yeah.
And so thankful for them.
Yeah, it just sounds like the Salvation Army overall just did an awesome job. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, that's what I would say as well. That they did an awesome job with what they did. They didn't get into the mess of schooling. They didn't get into the mess of boarding schools, of orphanages, whatnot. And certainly there was a lot of good work that could have been done there, but it was messy. There's murky water there, and so they kind of just like stayed above the fray in that.
Yeah, I wonder if sometimes doing less is better in some cases because of our destructive tendencies with big organizations and doing big schools. I don't know. Maybe that's a terrible thought, but it just popped in my head.
Well, I think that there should be caution. I think that's a good cautionary tale for us, looking at some of the faults of missionaries in schools in Alaska. Not that I think we should not do it, but that we need to be careful in the way that we do it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Okay. So let's transition to the Lutheran Church now. What is the story of the Lutheran Church in Alaska?
Yeah, the Lutheran Church. They're one of my favorite stories. And I think we mentioned them a little bit in another podcast, but we'll dive into them a little bit more now. And So probably don't need to refresh a lot of listeners on what Lutherans are, but obviously Lutherans are part of the Protestant movement started by Martin Luther, 1595 Theses. That should probably ring some bells for listeners. Yep. If you're not super familiar with the Lutheran Church, though, you might not realize that there's a lot of different synods. There's different groups of Lutheran. Not all Lutherans are the same. We're familiar with Baptist groups, that there's different Baptist groups, but there's also different Lutheran groups. And that's important for Alaska history in particular, because in Alaska, there's currently 3 branches of Lutheranism. And so there's the ELCA, which is the one that most people are familiar with, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And that is the more liberal Lutheran Church. So when people talk about, like, in particular, the ordaining of people who have homosexual lifestyles, the ELCA would affirm things like that. And so that's the more liberal side, but that's not all Lutherans. There's the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod that are also within Alaska, and they're far more conservative. And so you can't just say that all Lutherans are the same. So just something to keep in mind with that. And also, it wasn't until 1988 that the ELCA was born. It used to be 2 separate churches before 1988. There was the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church, which both obviously sound like the exact same thing, but they were not. And so
could have done some different naming there.
Us Christians, we're not that creative. First church, there's so many first churches. Anyways, moving on. So ELCA, though, wasn't formed until 1988. So even when you talk about the ELCA, you got to realize that you can't look at church history in the Lutheran Church and pin them down as, oh, this was the ELCA. No, they didn't exist till 1988. So all of the history that we'll look at was not ELCA, but separate Lutheran churches. So with that in mind, let's look at some of those Lutheran churches and Lutheran explorers. So the very first Lutheran on the scene, many of you probably already know who it was, though you might not have known he was Lutheran. The first Lutheran was 1741, Vitus Bering. He is claimed by the Lutheran Church. And so a lot of Alaska was named by the explorer Vitus Bering, who was a self-proclaimed Lutheran. And obviously he didn't come to evangelize. He came to explore. But it's worth noting that he was the first Lutheran. And if you read Lutheran history books, they're quick to claim him because they're like, oh, yeah, we were first. We were first.
Yes.
Okay, sure. You got it. You got it, Lutherans. Then you have it.
You can have it.
Also, there was another Lutheran that came early on. And in 1840, Adolf K. Ethelin was a Lutheran from Finland, and he moved to Alaska to work with the Russian American Company and brought with him another Lutheran pastor, Reverend Sidnius. I probably butchered those. I don't speak any Finnish. Is that what they speak in Finland? I don't know. I apologize to all the Finns out there. But anyways, right. These 2 Lutheran Finnish pastors, they came to work for the Russian American Company. And while they were here in Alaska, they were in Sitka. And so they started a church. But they were not officially sent by the Lutheran Church. They were simply here working. And because they were here, they started a church in Sitka. And that Lutheran Church was maintained by Adolf Ethelin from 1840 until 1865. And then another church, then another group of pastors came to replace them. And unfortunately, we don't really fully know all of the history of that. But as Russian American Company was sold to the Alaska Commercial Company, there had to have been some sort of transition. Regardless, these Lutheran pastors just basically disappeared from the history books. We don't know exactly what happened, but that church basically disappeared as well. And so it just ceased being a church. So that was the beginnings of the Lutheran Church, kind of in Alaska, but it was not official. The real official start of the Lutheran Church wasn't until the reindeer herders came. And so we talked a little bit about that on another podcast, but Sheldon Jackson, on his journeys throughout Alaska, visiting missionaries, visiting schools, he saw that there was a famine going on in many villages, and part of that was because of overhunting. That the whalers and the walrus hunters, also the hunters on land as well, the moose, the caribou, etc., that had been overhunted, and so there was a famine going on, and also Sheldon Jackson wanted to figure out how to give an economy to the native people so they could be more self-sufficient. So he came up with the idea that they should have reindeer, and just a reminder, they started up the reindeer project with Presbyterian money, $2,000 raised from their own funds to go get reindeer from Siberia and bring them over. Unfortunately, all of those reindeer died because they didn't have a good plan of how to care for the reindeer and how to pass on how to care for them. They just brought the animals over. It didn't work. And so in their second try, Sheldon Jackson, he got government money this time, which I don't know who he convinced in the government to give him money. Like, oh yeah, we tried this once and they all died. He might have left that part out. I'm not sure. But he convinced them to fund this reindeer project. And rather than going from Siberia, which makes more geological sense, he went to Norway and got Norwegian Laplanders, as some people call them, as they call themselves. Those people also, the Laplanders sometimes are also called Sami people, and in some circumpolar conferences, even today, they're called the white Eskimos. And so I don't think that's necessarily politically correct right now, but that's what they historically have sometimes been known as. And so they actually lived lives very similar to the native people in the circumpolar regions already, and they lived off the land, they lived off the caribou, and so very, very indigenous in culture.
Yeah, I think Norway and Alaska are on the same latitude. And so that makes a lot of sense. It would not have been a massive change for them.
Exactly. And so Sheldon Jackson tried to convince a bunch of Laplanders to come on over to Alaska with their reindeer herds, to purchase the reindeer and employed these herders. But they said they would not go unless they could bring their own pastor. And so their pastor agreed to go with them. Sheldon Jackson agreed to pay for the whole group plus the pastor to come over to Alaska and teach the native people how to herd their own reindeer. And so that pastor was Reverend Tolef L. Brevig. And so he arrived in August of 1894 on a boat with a lot of reindeer and reindeer herders. And so they brought their reindeer to the first reindeer station, Teller Station, which later became known as Brevig Mission and is still Brevig Mission to this day. And so brought the reindeer there, and the reindeer were handed out throughout Alaska to different churches and tribes and whatnot. And that's a story for another day. But they continued to have that main reindeer station at Brevig Mission, although it was named Teller Station at the time. And so initially, the official Lutheran Church was only interested in caring for their own people. The entire purpose of Reverend Brevig was to care for his own reindeer herders. And so that makes the Lutheran Church entirely different from all the other churches. They did not come in with the idea to evangelize. They definitely did not come in with the idea to Americanize. These were Norwegians caring for Norwegians.
Yeah, interesting.
So they just had no plans for expanding, and you can see that in the first 6 years, really, of the Lutheran Church in Alaska. So from 1894 when they arrived until 1900, they basically were entirely just focused on their own people. And it wasn't until the gold rush, as we see this affected pretty much every church, in 1898. There was the Three Lucky Swedes. That's a story for another day that you can look up. But the Three Lucky Swedes struck it rich in Nome. And so they knew that there was this reindeer station with a Lutheran pastor close by. And so some of the gold miners asked Reverend Brevig to come and hold church services for them. And so they did some church services for the gold miners, but especially in their travels, Reverend Brevig, between Nome and Teller Station, they interacted with a lot of native people. And as they did that, they saw the need for the gospel and also lots of other needs for the native people. In particular, in 1900, at the end of at the height of the gold rush, there was a great measles outbreaks, which we've talked about in other podcasts as well, and that just decimated the native population. And so that measles outbreak orphaned hundreds of children. And in response to the orphan crisis, the Lutheran Church did something a little bit different. They didn't immediately start an orphanage. Instead, what they did is they encouraged church people to take orphans into their own homes. And so that's a really interesting model that they had. And Reverend Brevig in particular also took in several orphans during his time. And he had a whole family. By the way, we didn't talk about them, but his wife and children came with him to Alaska. And so they invited orphans into their own homes and told other church members to do the same. But unfortunately, they realized pretty quickly on that there was too many orphans to care for in this way. And so they did also start up a children's home, but it was not their original plan. They simply wanted to invite them into their own families, into their own homes. And I just really like that. I mean, they were ahead of the times. Back in those days, children's homes were the method. And nowadays, of course, children's homes are not the method. That's not as desirable. Instead, of course, OCS encourages foster parents. And so our family was a foster family for a while. And so we know a thing or two about that. And in a lot of ways, it's harder, but it is really good. And it's better for an orphan to have a family rather than be in a group home. Anyways, so that was how they started, but they realized that there was a need that was bigger than they could meet just individually. So Reverend Brevig, he donated his entire year's salary of $2,900 plus $600 of his own savings to build the first Lutheran orphanage. Wow. And that is amazing right there. So, and it's a real interesting thing. The whole topic of having these orphanages, these children's homes, is really controversial. Some Native people had amazing experiences, and I can think of a number of them that we'll talk about in their testimonies of how they. It was really elders at this point, but there's an elder in Nome who'll tell his testimony about how he grew up in a children's home, and that's where he met Jesus, and that's where he experienced love, real love. Wow. And but there's also certainly other people who had different experiences. There is a book out there called "More Than God Demands" that follows one story of a Native person who was in the Lutheran children's home who feels like their culture was stripped from them. And so that is out there. There are other perspectives, so it is worth noting. And that's kind of a hard book to read, but when I read it, I see a very broken person who needs Jesus. And certainly there may have been some things that were done wrong to them and to their culture. But I think that God can bring. There has to be hope. God brings restoration, and that's the real answer.
That issue that you're bringing up is an interesting thing because I think it does speak to our fallen condition. When you consider the church started this orphanage for good intentions, good reasons, and then this good thing that's happening becomes twisted. It becomes a place where abuse happens and things like that. And it's just a sad reality of the brokenness in our world. And it's easy to point fingers at the church and organizations, blah, blah, blah. And we need to look at our own hearts, our own sinful hearts. Not that we did those things, but we're have this. we're all capable. That's where I was going. Yes, we all have the same fallen nature as the folks who perpetrated these. And so, yes, they take blame, but also have the humility to say, I have the same capability.
We all need Jesus.
Yes.
Me especially. But it is worth noting that in these orphanages, it wasn't pushed that the native people would stop speaking their native language, as was in some of the government schools, etc. In fact, there's stories of one of like little Emma. So little Emma was an orphan that learned Norwegian. So she didn't even learn English from the missionaries. She learned Norwegian because these were Norwegian missionaries. But little Emma, learned Norwegian from Reverend Brevig's daughter, Dagny, and her full name was Dagny Alaska Brevig because she was born in Alaska. But so Dagny Brevig and Emma became good friends, and not only did Emma learn Norwegian, Dagny Brevig became fluent in Inupiaq. So these two befriended each other and taught each other's languages. And that
cool.
is super cool.
Yeah.
And you could tell that this was such a special relationship, even in that Emma later on, and we have some of her journals and whatnot, but Emma, who, when she became an adult, got married and named her first child, her first daughter, Julia, and that was Reverend Brevig's wife's name. Emma's,
oh, sweet.
I mean, Dagny's mom's name, so named her Julia after Mrs. Brevig. And so clearly there was a very positive relationship there.
Yeah.
But Dagny Brevig is important also in the story of the Lutheran Church, not just because she befriended Emma and learned Inupiaq, was fluent in Inupiaq, but in 1913, Dagny Brevig became the youngest commissioned missionary of the Norwegian Lutheran Church and took over the school for the orphans. And she taught in both Inupiaq and English. So that's very important and unique, especially at 1913. There was not a lot of churches or schools that were teaching in the native language. And so good for the Lutheran Church. That was a big part of what they did early on. They kind of whatever the government's doing, they can do their own thing, but we're going to encourage the use of the native language. Let's see. What other things should we talk about? Oh, yeah. Okay. So Dagny also was a part of bringing the idea of having school teachers come out. And so it was her actually that recruited more of the Norwegian Synod Lutherans to come out to Alaska. And so other schools in the area, especially Igloo, which is now known as Mary's Igloo, was part of that. And cool story. The reason it's called Mary's Igloo today is that Mary was one of the native people who lived in Igloo. That's the name of the little town, little village. So Igloo, Mary, she came to faith because of the Brevigs as they were going back and forth from Nome to Teller, as we were talking about earlier. And so in 1904, she came to Christ, and she specifically asked for the mission to send people to Igloo and requested that they would build a school there and to teach the people about Jesus. And so I don't speak Norwegian, so this is a rough, but Reverend Jernagel, he responded to that call. I mean, it sounded like it could have been Norwegian, right? But if you look, it sounded
like it could have been from the movie Frozen.
That's probably where I got it from.
Yeah.
But so he was one of the ones that responded and went to Igloo. And so interesting, when he got there, though, there was no building. And often, some churches would build churches would build either churches or schools for the native people. But partially because of Mary, who had called for the school, the people of Igloo actually built their school and their church on their own in preparation for the Lutheran Church taking it over.
Wow.
And so the Lutheran Church staffed that church and school from 1906 to 1949.
Wow.
So that's just a great example of how it wasn't always that the native people it wasn't always that the white people said, oh, I'm going to go into this place and I'm going to spread the gospel. There's a number of instances of the native people. They asked for missionaries to come. They wanted it so bad that they built their own building. And we heard about that yesterday in the Covenant Church in Koyuk too. They built their own church. And so there was a desire amongst a fair amount of native people that they would have missionaries and church workers come.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's a pretty cool story of Mary's Igloo. Another interesting story is of, just like a lot of other churches, some of the best native evangelists were once shamans. And so Lutheran Church also has a story of Tuktu. And Tuktu was one of a number of shamans in the early days who converted to Christianity. And specifically, Tuktu would say that he came to Teller Station and he saw that the greatest spirit he'd ever seen was amongst the missionaries.
Wow.
And so
interesting.
Seeing that greatest spirit, he wanted to serve that greatest spirit. And so Tuktu was one of the
how much I would love to sit down with someone like Tuktu and just talk to me. Tell me everything in your life. That would just be a delight.
Amen. Well, when we get to heaven, we can do it.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, but pretty amazing. I mean, so clearly God was at work. The Lutheran Church came just for reindeer and to care for the reindeer herders, but clearly God was using them and spurring them on. And so cool, unique story. Unfortunately, 1908, Julia Brevig died, and she was preceded in her death by their son Carl and their daughter Borghild. And all three of them are buried there in the Teller Station. And so that obviously had a huge toll, took a huge toll on Reverend Brevig. And so in 1908, he went back to Norway. And the Lutheran Church, though, sent a couple more missionaries. This one's real rough. I don't think I'm even going to try his first name, but Reverend Torno. You can look it up in the history books, or let me know if you want the full name. But Reverend Torno, he took over the Teller mission in 1910. And so it was these next wave of missionaries, though, that really had a vision more for a regional ministry rather than just the reindeer station, whereas Brevig really was focused on the mission station and did some ministry as he was able in the region. The next wave of missionaries really wanted to expand the mission. And so from there, you can see that the Lutheran Church started expanding more. In fact, they didn't just go in the Norton Sound, Nome area. They also went down to the southeast, as that's where the party was amongst all of the denominations. And they founded a church in Petersburg in 1913. But also at that time, 1913, Reverend Brevig came back. And so he had gone back and kind of dealt with some personal stuff. But he came back, and so did Dagny. Dagny, Alaska Brevig also came back. And so that was very significant. Reverend Brevig only lasted for a few years. In 1916, his health began to fail, and he unfortunately left for the last time. But his ministry is still felt to this day. I mean, he got Brevig Mission over there.
Wow.
And definitely a big part of the ministry was the orphanage that he started up. And the orphanage, again, had a great need during the Spanish flu. And there's a couple of really good stories of native people who were there in the orphanage. Sam Alak, actually, his journals that he kept are one of the main sources for the Lutheran history. And so there's a few Lutheran history books, but I'd say the main one of Eskimos and Missionaries by Henriette Lund. That's my favorite Lutheran history book, of Eskimos and Missionaries. A large part of that history came from the journals of the native orphan Sam Alak. And so that's pretty cool. Also had journals from some of the other orphans there as well, and ones who had really good experiences. Let's see. The Lutheran Church also got into the medical missions field, as some of the other churches did as well. 1919, Anna M. Husseth came. And so the Lutherans in particular, they I'd say throughout their early history, they were mostly responding to needs. And so you can kind of see that in the different areas rather than just going in and fabricating like, oh, I need to go in because of this. They responded to needs. And so they entered the medical field in response to the Spanish flu. And so Anna Husseth was the first one on the field to do Lutheran medical missions. And a super awesome, cool story. She came in 1919. And then in 1920, she was at a church, at her church there, and amongst the native people there, she encouraged them to give an offering to do a special Easter offering, and they gathered together an offering to send to Madagascar. And I don't know for sure, but I would not be surprised if that was the first foreign mission financial gift from a native church in Alaska, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the first one. I certainly haven't found any other records of that. But yeah, so oftentimes we think of the native people, they are the receivers of mission, but no, we are all to be on mission. We are all called to go ye therefore. And so it's really cool that 1920, the native Lutherans, they saw that need and they responded, and super cool. So I believe this was in Shishmaref. The Lutheran Church had expanded out to Shishmaref. And in fact, Anna Husseth made such an impact in Shishmaref that years later the hospital was renamed for Anna Husseth. And so that's pretty cool. Trying to bring us further on towards modern times. 1921, it's worth noting that Reverend Elmer H. Dahl took charge of the Alaska field, and he served for 40 years until 1961. And so that gave the Lutheran Church some good stability.
I recognize that
Reverend
name.
Dahl claimed
was Dahl
really? Oh yeah.
Is he also like a scientist explorer, or am I mixing up guys?
He may be. I'm not totally sure. I don't know if he was, but he could have been. A lot of these, especially superintendents of denominations, they traveled around so much that it's certainly possible that he might have had some of those things where he explored. But I don't have that in my history books that I've read.
Okay. I think there is a Dahl
what I do have
who was that.
Is you're probably right. I might have to look that one up.
Okay.
But he did faithfully serve the Lutheran Church for many years. And he said in his later years, asking what his greatest achievement was in his time with the Lutheran Church, he said that his greatest achievement was seeing Sunday school programs become an indigenous project, with Eskimos leading classes for various age groups, beginning with kindergarten. And so that's really cool. They cool. had this vision that it was supposed to be an indigenous church leading. And so that's a really cool thing.
I think a term we use among, my circle of friends, I guess, is we say we're trying to work ourselves out of a job, which is Amen. Antithetical to the rest of the world. But, we want to just pass the baton. We don't want to stay there forever and be needed there.
Exactly.
And by the way, Adam, is his name William Dahl? Is that his name?
No, Elmer
Dahl. Okay, so it is a different person. There is a William Dahl who was like a scientist / explorer. Okay,
interesting. Maybe they're related. Certainly, that's possible too.
That's possible. Yeah. Yep. Okay, go ahead.
Cool. One thing, though, that the Lutheran Church wasn't as good at, and partially it's because of how they were set up coming out, not necessarily to start a mission in Alaska. They did not have their first native person attend a seminary and become a pastor until around 1922. And the first one that they have on their records was actually one from the orphanage. Leonard Sikialuk. sorry about that, and I probably didn't get that name too good either, but it's a Newtback name, Sikiagluk. And so he became the first Alaska Native to attend a Lutheran seminary. And unfortunately, shortly after he came back to Alaska to do ministry, he died from TB. And tuberculosis took out a lot of folks back in those days. But nevertheless, he was the first one. And but there have been others as well. Let's see. There's so many story facts there with the Lutheran Church. Something interesting, if you ever want to look it up, is 1923. We won't hit on this too much, but the Federated Norwegian Lutheran Young People Society of America. That's a mouthful right there. That's their whole name. The Federated Norwegian Lutheran Young People Society of America.
Yeah, no, 5 more times quickly.
They were trying to figure out how they could do some sort of mission service, and they came together, and these young people decided that God was calling them to plant a hospitality ministry in Ketchikan. And so I don't know how they came up with that, but they established the Lutheran Fishermen's Hotel in Ketchikan specifically for traveling fishermen. And that actually became a pretty cool, unique ministry for a number of years. And it's worth looking up if you're ever interested in that sort of stuff. But it wasn't until 1927 that the Lutheran Church moved into Anchorage. And this was not the Norwegian Synod. This was the Missouri Synod. And so they were the first ones into Anchorage. Sitka was restarted in 1940. And so you might remember Sitka started at the very beginning of this by people who worked for the Russian American company. But it was restarted, and apparently that same area that the first church was, same property. And so 1940, they're back in Sitka. 1941, they planted in Naknek. And so at this point, by the 40s, the Lutheran Church was really spread out. They weren't just centralized in the Seward Peninsula. They were all over the place. And so you can see that continuing in Cordova. They established a children's home there. Wasn't until 1955, though, that they established a Lutheran church in Nome. Even though they had a presence there in Nome, there was so many other churches that they never felt the need to go in and establish a church. But in 1955, they felt like the door was open. In 1965, the Lutheran Eskimo Mission Committee was formed to give the 4 native congregations more autonomy. And so that's an interesting thing. So kind of like separating out the road system and Western Alaska congregations.
Yep.
Yeah, there's some good and bad to that. But it's worth noting that I'd say that the motivation was that they wanted to give the native churches more autonomy. That is, they wanted to be an indigenous church. They also planted a church in Kodiak, 1969. And also a very interesting one is 1970, the Lutheran Church took over the church in Wales. And so we're not going to talk about the Congregationalists too much. In fact, maybe really at all, but that's kind of a footnote to Alaska church history. You really should look up the Congregationalist history. It won't take you probably too long to get the gist of it, but there are a couple of books written, and mostly it's about the martyrdom of Reverend Thornton. And so Reverend Thornton, he was the first missionary there in Wales for the Congregationalist Church, and he was only there, I want to say, for less than 2 years, and there were some people who were upset with him, some native people that came to his door and shot through the door and killed him, and that was the end of the. That was the end of the Congregationalist Church in Wales. So it was very short-lived. The Presbyterians took over for a while, but then they gave it to the Covenant Church, and so the Covenant Church had Wales for I want to say like 30-something years, and but Wales was always outside of the Covenant area, and so it was a little bit of a stretch to get out there. It was just outward mission station. And so when the opportunity came to give it to the Lutheran Church that was already in Shishmaref and in that area, it just made sense. So the Lutheran Church took over, and the church to this day is still called Lutheran Memorial Church. And so it's named after that first missionary who was martyred. And it is really interesting. And if you were to read the history of so Thornton, he actually kept journals, and you can read some of his own journals, and he probably was one of the most colonial minded missionaries. And so it's, not that anybody ever deserves to be shot, for sure, but I can see how he antagonized some of the locals there. And so it's interesting that they named the church after him. And I don't think probably most of the local Native people there don't remember that history and probably haven't read any of his journals. But yeah, it is just kind of an interesting little fact there.
Yeah.
That kind of brings us into modern times. We're into the 70s. And so most of us know the Lutheran Church expanded quite a bit. There's a lot of Lutheran churches, probably in almost every community that we can think of any decent size, different Lutheran synods. And they're one of the biggest churches worldwide. So they have been in Alaska since 1894. And that kind of completes our survey of different denominations. The only big denomination that we didn't hit in these podcasts was the Methodist Church. And so they actually have one of the best histories of all of the history books that I've read. Encourage you to check that one out on your own. It's I believe it's called Have Gospel Tent Will Travel. And it's got really good pictures, and it's just really, really well organized. It's enjoyable to read. It doesn't feel overwhelming. Kind of take it piece at a time. But the Methodists, they started out really focusing on southeast area and amongst the white population. And not that that's bad, but that's not been my area of focus. My area of focus has been more Western Alaska and Native churches. And Methodists did get out also to Unalaska, Unga, to the Aleutian chain, but that was not the focus of their ministry. And so anyways, you can check those out. Check out the Congregationalists. Also worth noting a couple other denominations that came a little bit later on. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, they came out in the late 20s, early 30s. Church of God, similar time as well. And so those two in particular, Seventh-day Adventist, Church of God, also have presences out in Western Alaska, which is why I mentioned them. But SDA, they have a history book. I forget what it's called, but you can look that one up. Church of God does not. Church of God, their history is very poor. And so maybe, hopefully, if there's anybody out there listening from the Alaska Church of God, maybe you should write that history.
Yes. More history is good. Yes, that would be helpful.
There you go. Oh, I found it. The Beginnings of Seventh-day Adventist Work in Alaska. That's the name of that book.
Okay. Thank you.
By Nadine Hansen.
Yep. Well, Adam, that's, are we landing the plane or is there something else you wanted to say?
Plane.
Okay. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And mentioning some of the other, just making little taglines about some of the other denominations is really helpful. But it demonstrate all we've done in the last 5 episodes is do a brush over. And when you do these, classes, you go in more in depth, and what you try to do here is to thin it down so it's a listenable length for a podcast.
Yeah, and hopefully it's listenable. So usually my classes for each denomination are 2 hours, and so it's tried to cut that down. I know, I'm sure it felt like trying to drink from a fire hose, but hopefully we kind of get some broad themes of what God was doing, some awesome things missionaries did, maybe some bad things that missionaries did, things that we can learn from, and also really just kind of combating some of those stereotypes of what a missionary was and did, and the church's motivation. And that's, I'd say, probably one of the main reasons why I like to tell Alaska church history stories, is to help people realize that most of the missionaries had really good hearts, and they wanted to serve Jesus with everything they had, and they didn't come in to try to destroy culture. And certainly there is a lot of cultural trauma, but I think we need to be careful not to just place all of the blame on the feet of the church. And just point to brokenness, but also to the Redeemer. And we always have to point to, where's the hope? Where is Jesus? And even in the discussions of decolonization and reclaiming your cultural identity among the native people, where's Jesus in the midst of that? Don't try to have, if you try to have conversations without Jesus in the middle of those, then you're never going to find the solution. You're just going to go in circles. You have to have Jesus in that. And some of it is looking back and seeing where Jesus was.
Yeah, I like that. Well, Adam, this is a topic that I've been wanting to spend time studying, and I've done a little bit. But what you've done is you have handed it to me on a big gold platter, and that you just really landed the plane. That's a good phrase. For me, in the church history, even though we had to knock out a lot of details for time, it really helps me wrap my mind around all of this history. And I hope that these 5 episodes are a good tool for that for others. And it does remind me of, while in the Old Testament, when the Israelites are wandering in the desert, God says again and again, remember what I did for you. Remember what I did for you by, getting you out of Egypt. And that word remember just comes up again and again and again, which of course is a reminder
Amen.
To look back to our past so we can see the realities of history to help us move forward in wisdom into the future. So I think you've done that for us. So Adam, this is a great tool, and I hope everyone who lives in Alaska listens to this, because the information is extremely valuable. So thank you again, Adam.
Praise the Lord. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Yep. God bless you.